The fluorescent lights of the hospital surgical suite had just been powered down for the evening, leaving Dr. Ethan Bellini with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that felt less like fatigue and more like a low-frequency hum vibrating through his skeleton. 12 hours of standing over a complex orthopedic procedure, saving a man's shattered knee, had left him incapable of processing anything more complicated than the shortest route from the hospital parking garage to his own bed. His home, Unit 47, a pristine beige stucco townhome in the highly exclusive, obsessively regulated community known as the Preserve, was his only sanctuary. He steered his unassuming charcoal sedan past the main gate, the familiar chime of the security scanner a small comfort, and drove the winding, manicured streets. He pulled up to his unit, keyed the entry code into the exterior pad, and the heavy sectional garage door began its low, mechanical ascent, a sound that always signaled safety. He drove in, killed the engine, and the comforting, airless silence of the garage settled around him. Ethan sighed, leaning his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes for one precious moment of stillness. Then, he opened them. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. His garage, a two-car tandem space with an identical twin door meant for only his car and his gym equipment, was occupied by an intruder, not a person, but a vehicle. A colossal bone-white Mercedes-Benz GLS SUV. It was parked diagonally across the space designated for his car, its polished grille nearly touching the utility sink, its rear end blocking the access path to his emergency supply cabinet. It was an act of parking so brazenly entitled it bordered on physical aggression. Ethan felt the exhaustion drain away, replaced by a sudden, icy adrenaline surge. His body, moments ago ready to collapse, was now taut and wired. He got out of his car, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the sealed concrete floor, and approached the hulking SUV. The car was locked. There was no note, no explanatory sign, only the faint, expensive scent of fresh leather and an overwhelming sense of possession. Then he saw it, fixed firmly to the rear bumper, catching the stark garage light, the gold-embossed, shield-shaped decal that identified its owner as a member of the community's governance body. The HOA decal, but one that was slightly larger, signifying the board. The car belonged to Beatrice Vance. Beatrice Vance, a woman in her late 50s, known throughout the Preserve as the self-appointed guardian of all things beige and boring, and the one person who could weaponize a zoning ordinance faster than a lawyer could draft a cease and desist. She was the vice chair of the Architectural Review Committee, a title she wore like a medieval crown, and she lived 3 streets over in the sprawling single-family section, not the compact townhomes. Ethan walked slowly around the front of the Mercedes, his mind racing through possibilities. Was she having work done at her house? Was this an emergency? The sight of a perfectly organized bag of high-end golf clubs in the passenger seat belied any claim of immediate crisis. This was simply a convenience for her. My convenience. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the official non-emergency HOA line. He knew the drill. It would lead to a voicemail box monitored by a junior administrator who would triage his complaint into a Level 3 violation queue, which meant it might be addressed sometime next Thursday. That was not going to work. He needed a direct line. He scrolled through the digital directory he had compiled, a necessary evil for anyone who lived under the Vance regime. He found the number for Beatrice Vance, listed under her husband's name, Maintenance Emergency Only. He hit dial. It rang 3 times before an overly formal, clipped voice answered, "Hello? This is the Vance residence. You are speaking to Beatrice. This is not a social line, so please state your maintenance emergency concisely." Ethan's voice was low, controlled, but infused with the cold, flat edge of impending conflict. "Beatrice, this isn't a maintenance emergency. This is Ethan Bellini, Unit 47. You have parked your car in my garage." There was a half-second pause, a beat where the world stopped waiting for Beatrice to process an unprocessable offense before she delivered her response, radiating condescension even through the phone's speaker. "Oh, Ethan. Yes, I'm aware. It's hardly a crisis, is it? I was dropping off a very delicate donation for the community center fundraiser, and my driveway is being pressure washed. You know how the new guidelines are on maintaining proper aggregate drainage. I simply needed a temporary secure space for the afternoon. It is 10:17 p.m., Beatrice. The afternoon is over and my surgical shift is over. I need my space back, now. Well, now, Ethan, there's no need to raise your voice. You town homeowners have that extra tandem space, don't you? It's not as if you need 2 spots. I'm quite certain one of the board members mentioned you only have 1 vehicle, which is, frankly, why I selected your unit. It was the least disruptive option. Ethan felt a slow, terrifying heat rising in his chest. The audacity was breathtaking. She hadn't just used his space. She had scouted his property, assessed his parking habits, and determined that he was a permissible target for her inconvenience. He realized this wasn't an oversight. It was an invasion, executed with the cold logic of an HOA official making an executive decision. "Beatrice, listen to me closely," Ethan said, his voice dropping another octave. He was no longer tired. He was methodical. "My garage is private property, clearly defined in the CC&Rs as an exclusive use area. You entered it without my permission. That is trespassing, and the fact that you are on the board makes this a material violation of community trust, not a minor parking issue." Trespassing? That's rather dramatic, Ethan. I accessed the space via the Community Master Code, which, while technically for maintenance access, I am authorized to use in mitigating circumstances. I was going to call you tomorrow morning to let you know. Master Code. That single revelation shifted the entire playing field. She hadn't broken a lock. She had used a system of trust to violate his security. The emotional stakes, already high, became intensely personal. This was not about parking anymore. It was about the sanctity of his private domain. Mitigating circumstances, Beatrice, would be a fire or a flood. Parking your luxury SUV in my private home space to avoid getting it wet during a pressure wash is not mitigating. It's arrogance. Ethan paused, taking a deep, measured breath that didn't sound measured at all. Here is what is going to happen. You have 10 minutes to return to Unit 47, retrieve your vehicle, and apologize for the unauthorized entry. If you fail to do so, I will be notifying the Sheriff's Department of an unauthorized vehicle on private property, and I will be filing a formal complaint against your board membership, citing the misuse of community access codes and severe security breaches. Beatrice scoffed. It was a loud, theatrical sound of dismissive disbelief. You wouldn't dare. You're threatening a board member over a temporary, completely harmless situation? I will have you fined for harassment before you can even spell sheriff. Try me, Ethan said simply. The 10 minutes start. Now. He hung up the phone before she could launch another volley of threats. He wasn't relying on the HOA's punitive process. He was relying on the law and, more importantly, his ability to enforce an immediate consequence. He looked at the digital garage door opener keypad mounted on the interior wall. The master code was still active. Beatrice had used it once, and she could use it again. This was the true vulnerability. He walked over to the keypad and began pressing buttons with careful, deliberate precision. He needed to lock her out of his garage permanently and immediately. He changed the core access code, the one he used for his own entry, to a new, complex sequence that was not shared with the HOA master system. The keypad chimed its acceptance. Access granted. Only to him now, but the Mercedes was still inside. He needed to ensure Beatrice couldn't simply come back with a different key, a spare key, or a tow truck, and remove the car at her leisure when she decided. His eyes fell upon the heavy-duty, stainless steel chain and padlock he used to secure his vintage racing bicycle to a wall anchor. It was the kind of chain meant to deter professional thieves. Ethan grabbed the chain, the cold metal heavy in his hands. He walked to the rear of the Mercedes and knelt down. The GLS had a hefty tow hitch receiver, a perfect, inescapable point of attachment. He looped the chain through the hitch mount, walked the chain to the heavy-duty steel eye-bolt he had anchored to the concrete floor years ago for earthquake safety, and secured it with the thick brass padlock. He pulled the key from the lock, placing it in his pocket. The car was now legally parked in a private, locked space, his space, and physically tethered to the property. It was immobilized. He was acting not as a vindictive neighbor, but as a property owner securing his domain and preventing a repeat offense. He backed his own car out of the garage and parked it in his designated driveway spot, a secondary offense in the HOA rulebook, but one he knew was minor compared to the main conflict. He then pulled the heavy sectional door down manually, locking the new, secure code behind the massive steel panel. The only way Beatrice Vance was getting her car back was if she spoke to him, admitted the violation, and suffered the full, intended inconvenience of her own entitlement. He walked into his house, the adrenaline still surging. He went straight to the living room window, which offered. The moment the side service door slammed shut, plunging Beatrice Vance into the utter thick black of the garage, the surgical calm in Ethan Bellini's chest cracked, replaced by a deep, satisfied hum. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of his living room window, listening. The furious, muffled scream he had heard immediately after her entry had been followed by a frantic fumbling, the scrabble of fingernails against the wall-mounted light switch. When the single harsh overhead fixture finally buzzed to life, it illuminated the scene like a theatrical spotlight on an arrested criminal. Beatrice Vance stood petrified, her expensive Italian leather handbag slipping from her shoulder. Her eyes, wide with shock, were fixed not on the great white monolith of her Mercedes, but on the thick silver chain, a visual line of demarcation between her entitlement and Ethan's resolve. The chain ran from the robust tow hitch of her GLS, taut as a steel cable, down to the massive, permanent anchor bolted into the concrete floor. Her face, previously a mask of boardroom superiority, now cycled through disbelief, confusion, and then volcanic rage. "What is the meaning of this, Ethan?" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the confined space, high and brittle. "Unlock my vehicle right now." "This is insane! This is criminal!" "I will call the police." Ethan didn't move from the window. He picked up the cordless landline, the landline he usually reserved only for calls to the hospital, and held it loosely. He spoke. His voice projected just loud enough for her to hear through the shared utility wall, calm and utterly without emotion. "You are welcome to call the police, Beatrice. I highly encourage it, actually. I will inform them that a non-resident Beatrice Vance, vice chair of the ARC, illegally entered my private deeded property, Unit 47, by misusing a community master access code, and is now attempting to tamper with a theft deterrent device I used to secure my property against an unauthorized encroachment." The silence from the garage was instant and deafening. He knew the word that had hit her hardest: misusing a community master access code. That was the nuclear option, the violation that could shatter her carefully constructed board authority. "This is not tampering," she finally spat out, recovering slightly, her voice now a low, dangerous growl. "This is my vehicle, secured inside my community. You cannot chain a person's property. That's extortion." "It is my property, Beatrice." "The garage floor is my deeded real estate. Your car is parked on it without my consent. It is trespassing property being secured until the owner rectifies the trespass. The key," Ethan added, tapping his jeans pocket lightly, "is currently in a secure location. You know the price of its return." "The price?" Her voice was laced with pure venom. "You want money for this? I will bury you in litigation, Dr. Bellini. I will have your practice investigated for emotional instability. I will have your license scrutinized." "I want two things, Beatrice," Ethan countered, stepping away from the wall to make a cup of tea. The domestic act a perverse counterpoint to the raging drama next door. First, a written, signed statement acknowledging the misuse of the master access code to enter Unit 47. Second, a public apology to the community management for abusing your position as a board member. Until those two documents are in my hands notarized, that Mercedes is staying right where it is. It's a fantastic, expensive paperweight, isn't it? The effect of his calm certainty was immediate. Her ranting stopped. She realized that the exhausted doctor she had dismissed was now acting with surgical precision. She was out of ammunition, physically trapped and legally exposed. The silence was broken only by the sharp, measured steps of her husband, Charles Vance, who had finally worked up the nerve to enter the utility area. Beatrice, what in God's name is happening? Charles's voice was heavy with fear and embarrassment. The driver, the garage is locked. You're inside his unit? Get this monstrosity off my car, Charles, Beatrice hissed. Ethan heard the distinct metallic sound of Charles attempting to tug the chain. Charles, don't, Ethan warned, his voice rising slightly in volume. Tampering with a locked security device is a felony in this state. I advise you to leave the premises immediately, or I will consider that a forced entry into my home, and I will call law enforcement. Charles, a man whose entire self-worth was invested in his financial solvency and HOA status, clearly understood the implication of the word felony. A beat of heavy silence, and then Ethan heard the side service door click shut. Beatrice Vance was gone, dragged away by her terrified husband, leaving her pride and her $100,000 SUV behind. The siege began the next morning at 7 a.m. Precisely. Ethan, awake early, was already enjoying a quiet, black coffee in his kitchen, waiting for the inevitable. The attack didn't come from the police, but from the official bureaucratic arm of the HOA. The first volley was a crisp yellow envelope shoved aggressively into his mailbox. It was a notice of immediate violation. Unit 47. The contents were dense and punitive. Violation 3.4c. Improper use of driveway. Fine, $250 per day. The occupant's sedan was parked entirely in the driveway, creating an aesthetic breach and potential ingress/egress obstacle. Violation 7.2a. Unauthorized external fixtures. Fine, $500. Use of an external, non-approved locking device, chain and padlock, constitutes an aesthetic nuisance and a permanent, unapproved modification to the property structure, I-bolt. Violation 1.1e. Harassment and board interference. Fine, $1,000, threatening, and hostile communication directed toward a board member. The grand total for the day, $1,750's payment, was due within 24 hours to avoid escalated action and lien placement. It was signed officially by Beatrice Vance, Vice Chair ARC, and co-signed by an HOA administrator. She hadn't wasted a minute. She was using the bureaucracy she controlled as a blunt financial weapon. Ethan smiled coldly, sliding the paper into a manila folder labeled Vance v. Bellini. He was a surgeon. He understood pressure and precision. He also understood that a successful operation requires a detailed understanding of the anatomy, in this case, the highly flawed anatomy of the HOA's bylaws. He called Sarah Jensen, a legal aid contact he knew from the hospital's pro bono unit, a sharp young lawyer who thrived on complex, messy property disputes. Sarah, I need a quick consult. I have a rather unusual case of vehicular squatting, trespass, and abuse of HOA power. He summarized the situation concisely, highlighting the master code misuse. Sarah listened, occasionally stifling a laugh. Okay, Ethan, first things first, she said, her voice turning professional. You are completely in the clear on the primary issue. The moment she entered your private garage without consent, it became a civil trespass. Securing the car is a legal act of self-help to abate the trespass, not extortion. She is using her power to generate fines. Now here is where we hit back. Give me the pressure points. The master code, that is her jugular. That code is for community emergencies, fire, burst pipes, security threats. For her to use it to store her golf clubs is a massive breach of fiduciary duty and, frankly, a huge security liability for the entire community. Everyone's garage is compromised. What's the play? You don't fight her violations. You ignore them for now. You go straight for the jugular. You file a detailed security incident report, not a complaint about parking, to every single board member and the community management company, demanding an immediate investigation into the board's misuse of emergency access keys, citing the fact that your private garage was breached by a sitting board member. You make it about security for everyone, not just your parking spot. This creates an internal political firestorm she can't control. Ethan finished his tea, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't had since the confrontation. I understand. I'll need evidence. You already have it, Sarah replied. You have the security logs from your own system that show the time of the code entry, your phone records from the conversation, and the physical evidence of her $100,000 mistake chained to your floor. Draft the letter. Make it dry, factual, and terrifying. By 9:30 a.m., the massive white Mercedes GLS, still chained to the floor, was no longer a secret. The preserve was a community of morning walkers, dog owners, and stay-at-home spouses whose primary occupation was observing the shortcomings of their neighbors. The sight of the HOA vice chair's recognizable HOA Queen personalized plate imprisoned behind a man's closed garage door, while his sedan was brazenly parked in the driveway, was the kind of spectacle that could disrupt the annual budget meeting. Ethan watched a cluster of neighbors slow down near Unit 47. Whispers replaced the usual greetings. Phones came out, not for pictures, but likely to text other residents about the unprecedented drama. The public humiliation, which Beatrice Vance valued above all else, was working. At 1 p.m., a tow truck arrived. It was a flatbed, professionally unmarked, but clearly dispatched with urgency. The driver, a tall man with a clipboard, parked across the street and approached Ethan's driveway, looking slightly confused by the sedan parked in front of the closed garage. Ethan met him at the curb. Holding the manila folder, "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice polite. "Yeah, I got a dispatch here. Address Unit 47. Says there's a tow request for a white Mercedes GLS inside the garage. Unauthorized parking. Owner wants it moved. The owner of the Mercedes or the owner of the garage?" The tow driver checked his clipboard. "The requesting party is a Mr. Charles Vance. He..." Three emergency vehicles that had peeled out of the mixer parking lot converged on the management office like vultures. Their drivers, Robert Caldwell, board chair, Brenda Hayes, treasurer, and Peter Chen, secretary, clutching their printed security incident reports like indictments. Ethan's strategically placed document had achieved its desired effect. It had created absolute panic, not just in Beatrice Vance, but in the entire ruling body responsible for the community's seven-figure operating budget. The lights in the management office conference room blazed until 1 a.m., illuminating a scene of toxic bureaucratic implosion. Robert Caldwell, a retired CEO with a low tolerance for unnecessary risk, conducted the meeting with the cold fury of a man watching his investment portfolio crumble. Beatrice Vance, having been dragged away from the mixer by Charles, tried to control the narrative, her voice vibrating with injured innocence. "This is a tempest in a teapot, Robert. A personal vendetta by a hysterical single man over a temporary parking issue. He is attempting to extort the board by fabricating a security crisis." Fabricating? Robert slammed his palm on the mahogany table. "Beatrice, the letter is clear. You use the master access code to enter a private deeded dwelling for the purpose of storing your golf clubs. That code is for burst pipes and natural disasters. If this goes public, and it is already on the bulletin board, Beatrice, every homeowner in the preserve will demand a security audit. Our insurance carrier will see this as a gross negligence, and we will face liability the size of a small island nation." Brenda Hayes, the treasurer, her face pinched and pale, chimed in, pointing a trembling finger at the document. "He even attached the fines you levied against him. $1,750 for parking his own car in his own driveway. This looks like textbook abuse of power, Beatrice. This is how class action lawsuits start." The board, faced with the existential threat of collective liability and public censure, turned on their vice chair with brutal efficiency. They weren't protecting Ethan. They were protecting their own financial and social standing. Peter Chen, the quiet secretary who normally just took minutes, read aloud from the bylaws in a shaky voice. Section 2.1F. Abuse of fiduciary duty. Any board member found to have willfully misused privileged, community access, or financial data for personal gain or retribution shall be subject to immediate censure and temporary suspension of all official duties pending a full, independent audit. The motion was swift, clinical, and unanimous. Beatrice Vance was stripped of all board authority, effective immediately. Her access to the community fine system and master codes was revoked. Robert Caldwell ordered her to retrieve her car and settle the dispute with Dr. Bellini at her own expense, demanding a written resolution by noon the next day. Beatrice was blindsided. Her power, the only thing that had defined her social standing for a decade, vanished in the sterile air of a conference room. She stumbled out of the management office, Charles trailing behind her like a crushed shadow, the white Mercedes still sitting inert, chained in the dark of Ethan's garage, a silent, humiliating monument to her downfall. The morning brought the next phase of the confrontation. Not a hostile attack, but a pleading, desperate surrender. At 8 a.m., Ethan's doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Charles Vance standing there alone, looking utterly miserable. Charles was impeccably dressed, but his tie was slightly askew, and his face was drawn and unshaven. He wasn't the same man who had confidently towed his wife's car the day before. "Dr. Bellini," Charles began, his voice raspy and humble. "Please, may I come in? This situation has spiraled out of control." Ethan stepped aside, letting Charles enter the foyer. The surgeon remained standing, arms loosely crossed, maintaining a cold. "Professional distance. I have the check, Ethan," Charles said, fumbling in his wallet and producing a cashier's check for a startlingly large sum. "Here. This is for the inconvenience, the disruption, the stress. Call it $10,000, for the key and for your silence. The board has suspended Beatrice. She is completely humiliated. Please just take the money. Let us get the car out and we disappear. We'll resign from the HOA completely." Ethan didn't even glance at the check. "Mr. Vance, I'm a surgeon. I don't operate for money. I operate for precision. Your wife violated the one thing I value, the security of my home. You compounded that trespass by trying to illegally tow her car from my property, making you an accessory. I was trying to fix her mistake," Charles pleaded. "Your mistake, Mr. Vance, was underestimating the consequences of entitlement," Ethan stated. He leaned in slightly, his gaze piercing. "My price hasn't changed. I want 2 documents, notarized, a full written confession of her misuse of the master access code and a public statement detailing her abuse of her board position. I want the truth, Mr. Vance, not hush money, and I want those retaliatory fines of $1,750 officially rescinded and an apology sent to me via certified mail from the full board." Charles stared at the uncashed check, then at Ethan's implacable face. "She will never sign a confession. It means ruin. She won't just be off the board. She'll be a pariah. We'll lose everything we built here. Then she can take the bus," Ethan said flatly. "The Mercedes stays put. You have until $5 p.m. Charles left, the check still on Ethan's counter, a token of a negotiation that failed because the currency was wrong. Ethan put the check in the garbage. The 5:00 p.m. deadline came and went. The Mercedes remained chained. Ethan felt the quiet triumph of a long, difficult surgery successfully completed. He had won the neighborhood war, but Beatrice Vance was not built for quiet surrender. For her, political humiliation was a wound so deep it demanded total destruction of the offender. She had failed to defeat Ethan on the battlefield of property and power. She would now attack him on the only ground where he was truly vulnerable, his professional life. At 7:30 p.m., the hospital's secure internal messaging system pinged on Ethan's tablet. It was an email flagged as urgent personnel from Dr. Lawrence Sterling, the chief of staff and chair of the credentials committee. Ethan's blood ran cold before he even clicked on it. Dr. Sterling was a powerful, distant figure, and he only contacted staff when the situation was dire. The subject line read, "Formal Review Notification, Dr. Ethan Bellini." The body of the email was a sterile, procedural masterpiece designed to instill dread. "Dr. Bellini. This correspondence serves as formal notification that the Credentials Committee has received an anonymous, highly detailed complaint alleging potential breaches of professional ethics and demonstrating a severe lack of judgment and emotional stability that could impact surgical performance. The complaint specifically references a recent, documented incident involving a property dispute within your community and includes allegations of aggressive, hostile, and extortive behavior that reflect poorly on your capacity for rational, high-pressure decision-making required of a chief orthopedic surgeon, effective immediately. Until the Credentials Committee can convene an emergency session, your surgical privileges are suspended. You are to cease all scheduled operating room procedures. Your outpatient clinic appointments may continue, but only under the direct supervision of an assigned mentor. You are required to attend a mandatory, recorded meeting with the committee on Monday at 9 a.m. Further details regarding the specific allegations will be provided at the meeting. Ethan dropped the tablet onto the soft rug. The air left his lungs in a rush, not of fear, but of pure, white-hot disbelief. Beatrice. It had to be Beatrice. She hadn't just whined to a friend. She had constructed a professional assassination. She had taken a neighborhood parking dispute and surgically framed it as evidence of a dangerous, unstable doctor. She must have leveraged a connection, a board member at the hospital, an acquaintance on the state board, and provided enough specific detail about the extortive chaining and harassment to trigger an official review, suspension of privileges. Mandatory meeting. This wasn't a fine. This was an attempt to dismantle his life's work. He looked out the window at the looming white shape of the Mercedes-Benz, now bathed in the glow of the security lights. It was no longer a symbol of petty tyranny, but a loaded weapon aimed directly at his professional heart. Ethan picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly, but his mind perfectly clear. The surgeon's instinct had kicked in, recognized the massive trauma, stabilize the patient, and prepare for the counter-operation. He dialed Sarah Jensen. "Sarah, it's Ethan." "The game just changed," he said, his voice hard as glass. "Beatrice Vance didn't just fight the HOA, she just had my surgical privileges suspended. I need to know the statute of limitations on a multi-million-dollar defamation and tortious interference lawsuit." The Mercedes GLS sat chained in the garage, a silent hostage. But now it wasn't just a car. It was leverage. Ethan had his legal grounds for the original trespass. But Beatrice had just given him grounds for a financial and professional countersuit so severe, it would not just remove her from the community, but bankrupt her for life. The fear that had briefly seized Dr. Ethan Bellini evaporated, replaced by the deep clinical focus of a surgeon facing a grade 4 bleed. Beatrice Vance had crossed the line from petty neighbor to professional assassin, and in doing so had given Ethan the legal grounds for a counterattack that transcended the bounds of the preserve. The stakes were no longer about a parking spot or a fine. They were about a $300,000 a year career and the integrity of a man's reputation. Sarah Jensen, Ethan's legal contact, was on the line within 5 minutes. Ethan delivered the facts of the hospital suspension notice with chilling precision. "Tortious interference and defamation," Sarah confirmed, her voice now hard and professional. "She leveraged a personal dispute, your legal, albeit unconventional act of securing your property, and presented it to your professional body as evidence of mental instability and an extortive nature. That's calculated malice, Ethan. The damages will be enormous: lost income, emotional distress, and career-related losses. We can sue Beatrice Vance for every dime she has, and likely the HOA board for aiding her retaliatory fines. The hospital meeting is Monday morning," Ethan stated. "I need to go in there with more than just a lawyer's threat. I need proof that the complaint is purely retaliatory, stemming directly from the illegal trespass she committed. I need to show them the anatomy of her malice." "You need leverage that moves faster than the court system," Sarah agreed. "The Mercedes. It's your only piece of immediate physical evidence that proves she was trapped and humiliated before she filed the complaint. It proves motive, but you need to link her actions at the HOA directly to the hospital complaint." Ethan walked to the center of his living room. The garage door was silent, separating him from the expensive white hostage. He activated the secure log on his phone. "I have the phone recording," Ethan said, recalling the quick, desperate call with Beatrice the night of the trespass. "I record all calls with the HOA. It's a habit. I have her admitting she used the master code for mitigating circumstances and then threatening me with fines. I also have the board's immediate official suspension notice for her, signed by Caldwell confirming her abuse of power, which happened before the hospital notification arrived." "That's excellent," Sarah breathed. "The timeline is everything. Trespass and securing the car, your action; suspension of her power, her humiliation; hospital complaint, her retaliation. It's a perfect chain of causation. We take this to the board chair Caldwell tonight." not Charles. Caldwell is the one who will lose his house when we sue the board for covering her tracks. He has the power to force her hand. Ethan didn't wait for a phone call. He dressed in surgical scrubs, his uniform of authority and precision, and drove straight to Robert Caldwell's sprawling lakeside house, the unofficial seat of power in the preserve. The board chair answered the door looking haggard. He was clearly expecting a call, not a personal visit from a man whose career he had just inadvertently helped torpedo. "Dr. Bellini!" "What in God's name?" "I thought this was settled." Caldwell's voice was weak, his eyes darting to the cars driving past. "It is settled, Mr. Caldwell." "But the terms have changed," Ethan said, stepping just inside the foyer, a position that was respectful but imposing. Beatrice Vance escalated this from a property dispute to tortious interference with my professional life. She has had my surgical privileges suspended based on this HOA conflict. Caldwell's jaw dropped. Suspended? No, she couldn't have. I didn't authorize that. We told her to settle this. She didn't need your authorization to make an anonymous, malicious complaint to the Credentials Committee, Ethan countered, his voice a low, steady rumble. She only needed the malice and the motivation, which your board provided by suspending her. I'm giving you 1 hour, Mr. Caldwell, to save yourself and your board from a professional and financial lawsuit that will strip every one of you of your assets, personally and professionally. Caldwell leaned against the wall, defeated. What do you want, Ethan? The car is still in your garage. We know. The car is now irrelevant. It is evidence. What I want is the complete, immediate, and irrevocable withdrawal of the complaint filed against me at St. Jude's Hospital. It must be a formal communication from Beatrice Vance to Dr. Sterling, not an anonymous letter, admitting the complaint was retaliatory, baseless, and factually inaccurate, stemming solely from the personal dispute over her illegal garage entry. She will never sign that. That is a signed confession of professional misconduct. She will be disbarred from every committee in the state. Exactly, Ethan said. Her ruin is the only leverage you have left. If that letter is not on my desk by 6 a.m. Monday morning, I will file a $20 million lawsuit against Beatrice Vance, Charles Vance, for attempting to tow illegally, and every single member of this board, including you, for aiding and abetting the creation of the retaliatory fines used as evidence in the professional complaint. My lawyer has the complaint drafted. We file at 9:01 a.m. Ethan produced a thin, typed paper from his pocket. It wasn't a court filing, but a detailed draft of the letter he required. Tell her to read this, Ethan commanded, pushing the paper into Caldwell's hand. It states that the complaint was an act of personal vengeance for the security breach she committed. You have one choice, Mr. Caldwell. Your board member's net worth or Beatrice Vance's pride. You choose. Ethan turned and walked out, leaving the board chair holding his fate in a crumpled piece of paper. The night stretched into a tense, agonizing vigil. Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, going over the notes for the Credentials Committee meeting, anticipating every hostile question. Why did you chain the car? Did you lose control? Why didn't you call the police immediately? His defense hinged on one fact. He had never retaliated. He had merely secured his property against a trespasser, and she, in turn, had committed the true act of malice. At 3:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. An unknown number. Ethan knew exactly who it was. The Vances had exhausted every official channel and every ally. This was the final desperate plea, he answered. His voice was steady. Dr. Bellini, Ethan, please. It wasn't the clipped, superior tone of the HOA queen. It was Beatrice Vance, and her voice was a thin, reedy wire, hollowed out by fear. The years of entitlement had been stripped away, leaving only a woman facing total ruin. I know what you've done, she whispered, the words shaking. Caldwell brought me the letter. You can't ruin me for this. We'll sign the confession about the master code. We'll pay any fine you demand. Just don't file the tortious interference. You'll destroy Charles. You'll destroy everything. You already destroyed everything, Beatrice, Ethan replied, the coldness in his voice unwavering. You attacked my livelihood, the very reason I stand on this earth. You committed an act of professional assassination because I wouldn't let you use my garage. That Mercedes in my garage? That is nothing. The career you tried to take? That is everything. What if I go to Dr. Sterling myself? I tell him the complaint was a mistake? A misunderstanding? She pleaded. It has to be the letter, Beatrice. The one Caldwell has. It must state in your hand that the complaint was retaliatory, detailing your misuse of the master code, and it must be notarized. I need legal immunity from the hospital's internal investigation, and you need to sign a full, immediate resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately, citing the misuse of community access. A terrible silence stretched between them, filled only by Beatrice's ragged breathing. This was the moment of complete surrender. You win, she finally choked out, the two words sounding like a lifetime of humiliation. You have ruined me. I will sign the letter. I will send it by courier, but you must unlock the car immediately afterward. I will unlock the car once the hospital confirms receipt of the retraction and confirms the complaint has been officially expunged. Ethan corrected, shifting the leverage one last time. Not a moment before. You tried to end my career, Beatrice. You will have to work to save your car. Send the letter and the notarized resignation to Caldwell right now. He knows what to do with it. Beatrice hung up without another word. Ethan walked to his kitchen, the floor cold beneath his feet. He had won the legal battle, but he still had to face the credentials committee on Monday. The letter of retraction was necessary, but it wasn't enough. He had to face his peers and explain, with perfect ethical clarity, why a surgeon had to chain an HOA board member's car to his floor. Ethan walked over to his laptop and began drafting his statement for the credentials committee, summarizing the entire conflict into a single, devastating narrative of abuse of power and professional malice, ready to present the board's humiliating resolution as the final piece of evidence. The only thing left to do was wait for the morning and deliver the closing argument. Sunday passed in a blur of focused preparation. Dr. Ethan Bellini, treating his Monday morning credentials committee meeting like a 10-hour surgical procedure, refused to allow panic or exhaustion to compromise his focus. He had distilled the sprawling, venomous neighborhood conflict into a single, irrefutable ethical argument. At 7 a.m. on Monday, the official documents arrived. A harried courier delivered a sealed envelope to Ethan's doorstep. Inside were two documents, both bearing the crisp, unassailable stamp of a notary public, formal retraction, and affidavit. A single-page letter, signed by Beatrice Vance to Dr. Lawrence Sterling, Chief of Staff. It stated, under penalty of perjury, that the previous complaint regarding Dr. Bellini's conduct was wholly fabricated and submitted out of personal spite and retaliation for a private property dispute, and that the allegations of instability were false and malicious. It included a chilling, concise admission of the Master Code misuse, HOA Board resignation, Beatrice Vance's immediate, full resignation from the Board of Directors, citing personal conduct incompatible with fiduciary duty. A text message from Robert Caldwell followed immediately. Retraction hand-delivered to Dr. Sterling's office at 6:30 a.m., proof of delivery attached. Good luck, doctor. The threat was neutralized. But Ethan still had to defend his unconventional action, chaining the car, to the highest professional body in the hospital. He had to demonstrate that his response was not unstable, but the calculated defense of an ethical professional against calculated malice. The credentials committee meeting room felt colder and heavier than an operating theater. Dr. Lawrence Sterling, a man whose face was usually impassive, looked stern, flanked by 3 senior physicians and the hospital's general counsel, Mr. Alan Stone. Ethan sat alone at the long table, dressed in his finest suit, holding the manila envelope containing his evidence. Dr. Sterling began without preamble. Dr. Bellini, we received a highly concerning complaint regarding your judgment and control in a recent civilian matter, leading us to temporarily suspend your surgical privileges. The core issue, as we understand it, is a property dispute escalated by you to a level that is, frankly, unprecedented. The report describes you as chaining a neighbor's vehicle inside your own garage to extort a settlement. We must hear your explanation for this highly aggressive course of action. Thank you, Dr. Sterling, Ethan said, his voice measured and articulate. I welcome the scrutiny. My action was not aggressive. It was preventative. It was the only legal self-help remedy available to abate a hostile, premeditated act of trespass by a known abuser of power. He laid out the narrative in 4 phases, using the language of a diagnostician. Phase 1, the initial trespass. At 10:17 p.m., a non-resident and sitting HOA board member, Beatrice Vance, violated the security of my private, deeded dwelling, my garage, Unit 47. She did this by illegally using the Community Master Access Code, a code reserved for life or death emergencies. Her stated purpose was to park her car on my property because she disliked my parking my own car in my own driveway. This was not a mistake. It was the abuse of a privileged board position to violate a homeowner's security. Phase 2, securing the perimeter. My primary duty as a resident and a homeowner is security. Her car was illegal trespass on private property. Had I simply called a tow truck, she would have used her HOA authority to block the tow, fine the company, and retaliate. Chaining her car was not extortion. It was the legal, physical abatement of trespass, securing my property, and providing the leverage necessary to force accountability for her illegal use of the master code. Phase 3, escalation and malice. The moment I secured the car, Mrs. Vance, having her own entitlement trapped, weaponized the HOA's punitive apparatus. She issued $1,150 in retaliatory fines, which the board later invalidated. Ethan paused and looked directly at Mr. Stone, the counsel. And when that failed, she filed the anonymous, malicious complaint that temporarily cost me my surgical privileges, a clear act of professional vengeance. Phase 4, the IRO, irrefutable resolution and outcome. Ethan pushed the notarized envelope across the table. This is Mrs. Vance's official notarized retraction, delivered this morning. It confesses that the complaint filed against me was wholly fabricated and submitted out of personal spite and retaliation for the property dispute. Furthermore, I have her signed resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately, citing the misuse of community access. A stunned silence fell over the room. The Credentials Committee was used to ethical gray areas and veiled threats. They were not used to notarized confessions of malice from the opposing party. Dr. Sterling picked up the retraction letter, scanning the text. His expression shifted from skepticism to absolute clarity. Mr. Stone, Sterling addressed the counsel. Given this evidence, a formal notarized retraction admitting malice, does the initial complaint hold any professional weight? Mr. Stone adjusted his tie, visibly unnerved. No, Dr. Sterling. This document not only destroys the credibility of the complainant, but effectively proves Dr. Bellini's position. He was responding to a pattern of illegal conduct and retaliatory abuse, not demonstrating a lack of judgment. In fact, he demonstrated extraordinary control and tactical clarity in forcing the truth to surface. Dr. Sterling looked at Ethan, the corner of his mouth turning up slightly. Dr. Bellini, you chose an aggressive strategy, but you executed it with surgical precision. The leverage you maintained was necessary to obtain the truth and protect your livelihood from a malicious attack. The ruling was swift. The temporary suspension of surgical privileges was immediately lifted and expunged from his record. The committee concluded that the complaint was baseless and the result of external malice. They voted to initiate an internal review into the integrity of the anonymous complaint submission process, a major victory for every physician who had ever been subjected to a baseless attack. Ethan arrived back at the preserve at 11:30 a.m. He parked his sedan in his own driveway, deliberately placing it to maximize the dramatic sightline. Waiting by his garage stood Beatrice and Charles Vance. Charles was pale and rigid. Beatrice was wearing dark sunglasses, but the rigid slump of her shoulders showed the crushing weight of her failure. They had the paperwork. They were waiting for the promised final act. Ethan walked slowly up the driveway, the brass key to the industrial-grade padlock glinting in his hand. He didn't speak a word until he reached the garage door. He input the code, and the heavy door rumbled slowly upward, revealing the white Mercedes GLS, still tethered to the floor like a prisoner. The sight of the chain, once a symbol of defiance, was now an emblem of her complete and utter defeat. Ethan knelt and snapped the padlock open. The metallic clink echoed in the garage. He tossed the lock and chain into the corner, the sound like a final gavel strike. He straightened up and faced Beatrice, taking off his own sunglasses. He was no longer the frazzled homeowner. He was the successful professional who had just defended his career. The hospital confirmed the retraction and expungement at 11:00 a.m., Ethan stated, his voice quiet. You are free to retrieve your vehicle. Beatrice stepped forward, her mouth opening to deliver some final, bitter salvo. Ethan cut her off, his words deliberate and devastating. Don't say a word, Beatrice. That car cost you your HOA power, your community reputation, and nearly my career. You have spent $100,000 to learn one simple, expensive truth. You don't get to park your entitlement in my private space. She flinched as if struck. She didn't look at him again. She slid past him, got into the Mercedes, and hit the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, a discordant sound of expensive defeat. Charles, standing paralyzed by the trauma, finally found his voice. We're selling, Dr. Bellini. We're leaving the preserve. Ethan simply nodded. Good. Beatrice backed the GLS out of the garage, the tires squealing slightly as she turned too fast. The Mercedes was gone, speeding down the street, disappearing from the preserve entirely. Ethan stepped into his now empty garage. The only evidence left was the permanent anchor bolt in the concrete floor and a clean patch where the tires had been parked for 3 days. The emptiness felt vast and deeply satisfying. He secured the garage door and stood in his driveway, watching the silence settle back over the neighborhood. The HOA queen was dethroned, her reign ended, and justice had been served not with vengeance but with meticulous, unyielding accountability. Ethan walked back inside his house. The ordeal concluded and picked up his phone. He had an emergency orthopedic case scheduled for the afternoon, a shattered tibia that required his full, steady focus. He was back where he belonged, having used the precision of a surgeon to excise a source of malice from his life and the life of his community.